Chief Yvonne Gaines had long since learned how to walk a tightrope without looking down. In a city like Eastbridge, large enough to have problems, yet small enough to pretend they didn't exist, her presence as the first black female police chief wasn't just a matter of record. It was a statement. She carried herself with the weight of history, responsibility, and resistance all braided into the same tightly coiled bun she wore under her uniform cap. Her days started before dawn. By 5:30 a.m., she was already in the gym. Not because she wanted to. She was pushing 60, but because she had to be sharper, stronger, and faster than the stories written about her. Her body bore scars from years in patrol. Her mind from battles even bullets couldn't leave behind. But she didn't complain. She showed up. Every day. She was a woman raised in the church, mentored by civil rights veterans, and seasoned in precincts where every mistake by a woman of color was amplified tenfold. Yvonne had built her career from the ground up, brick by brutal brick, never asking for favors, just opportunities. Her rise to the top wasn't without resistance. There were whispers when she was promoted, grumblings that she was a diversity hire, that she was too soft, too political, or worse, too black. But no one could question her record. She reduced violent crime in Ward 7 by 43% in 2 years. She revamped community policing and mandated body cam compliance before it was politically popular. Her strategies won national praise. Yet in her own house, the Eastbridge Police Department, she could still feel the coldness in the air when she walked past certain offices. Thin smiles, slower salutes, loyalty wrapped in protocol but lacking sincerity. She understood the cost of visibility. Reform, real reform, was never welcomed by those who benefited from the rot. She introduced civilian oversight, required racial bias training, and demoted 3 officers caught falsifying arrest records. These weren't just administrative moves. They were declarations. And with each decision, she noticed a shift. Less eye contact in meetings. More anonymous complaints sent to the mayor's office. Her job became a battlefield, but she was no stranger to war. Still, Chief Gaines found moments of light. Every Friday, she met with a group of high school girls, most of them black and brown, to mentor them about leadership and law enforcement. They called her Auntie Y, and she allowed it. With them, she wasn't the stern chief. She was Yvonne, the girl who had once watched her uncle get pinned to a squad car for no reason other than being a black man in the wrong neighborhood. She told the girls the truth, that change was slow, painful, and often thankless, but worth it. Her staff meetings were crisp and focused. She was never unkind, but always clear. She expected excellence, accountability, and integrity, and she modeled it every day. Local news outlets loved her. She gave sound bites that echoed with moral clarity, and interviews where her tone was unshakable. She didn't just wear the badge, she dignified it. But she also knew the badge could betray her. She'd seen it happen to others. She had prepared her soul for it. Yvonne's home was her sanctuary, a modest 2-story house near the lake, filled with family photos and jazz records. Her son Malcolm was in his final year at Howard Law, inspired by her strength and haunted by her burden. They spoke every night. It was their ritual, one last line of defense against a world eager to define them. In quiet moments, Chief Gaines would stare at the framed photo on her wall, a black and white image of her grandmother in Selma, holding a protest sign. That legacy wasn't abstract to her. It was blood memory, and she was determined not to let it die in the fluorescent halls of Eastbridge's precincts. But the signs of revolt were growing. A report leaked. An officer reassigned after speaking out. A memo altered after it left her desk. These were small cracks in a dam that had long held back a flood of resentment. She sensed it. Her instincts, honed over decades, whispered of something brewing beneath the surface. Not just pushback, something more calculated. Yet she pressed on, because that's what black women like her had always done. With grace under pressure, with power that didn't always roar. Chief Yvonne Gaines was not naive. She knew you could be loved in the headlines and hated in the hallways. But still, she stood tall. What she didn't know, what no one knew, was that everything she had built was about to be tested, not by a criminal, but by the very system she had spent her life trying to fix. The morning it happened felt no different than the dozens before it. Chief Yvonne Gaines had just finished her daily run, the pavement still damp from a night's drizzle, her breaths measured like everything else in her life, controlled, disciplined, exact. She returned home to the quiet hum of her kitchen, poured a cup of black coffee, and flipped through the headlines, her mind already piecing together the day's agenda. Meetings with the city manager, a press statement on rising opioid cases, and a community walkthrough in the Eastview district. Just another day commanding a city. But history rarely knocks before it bursts through the door. At exactly 7:42 a.m., the knock came. Not a knock, really, more a pounding. Heavy, abrupt, and loud enough to cause her cat to leap from the windowsill. Yvonne opened the door expecting a neighbor, maybe even an early courier. Instead, she was staring down the barrel of a reality she'd long feared, but never expected to live. 5 uniformed officers, eyes hard, stance wide, weapons holstered but hands hovering too close. They didn't hesitate. They didn't explain. Before she could even reach for her badge, they had her turned, arms behind her back, and metal cuffs tightened around her wrists. No Miranda rights, no questions, only cold steel and the click of a body cam she didn't activate. Neighbors watched from behind blinds. One elderly woman gasped from her porch, fumbling for her phone. By the time they shoved Yvonne into the back of the cruiser, shaky footage was already making its way to social media. Within minutes, the image of Eastbridge's police chief, black, female, cuffed, and stunned, began its viral descent into public consciousness. The charge? They said it was obstruction of justice. Something about tampering with evidence and an officer involved, shooting, she had personally ordered reviewed. Yvonne knew the case well. A young black teenager, 17, had been killed during a pursuit. The officer claimed the boy reached for something. No weapon was found. Bodycam footage was mysteriously corrupted. She had demanded an internal review and temporarily relieved the officer. It wasn't vengeance, it was protocol. But in departments like Eastbridge, protocol often felt like betrayal to those who had grown used to impunity. By noon, every major news outlet had the story. Some whispered of corruption. Others painted it as a political takedown. But the loudest voices came from the people, those who had once doubted her and those who had always believed in her. The video had struck a chord, not just because of who she was, but because of what she represented. A black woman in command, treated as a threat in her own home, by her own team. Yvonne sat in the holding cell, her back straight, eyes steady. The walls were familiar. She had walked these halls as a sergeant, a lieutenant, a chief. Now, she occupied them in disgrace. But the irony wasn't lost on her. The same policies she fought to uphold, the transparency, the body cams, the accountability, would now become her defense. Outside the precinct, protests were already forming. Teens she mentored held handmade signs. Clergy members, civil rights lawyers, and even her old academy instructors began to speak out. This isn't just about Chief Gaines, one sign read. It's about all of us. The message was spreading. A storm was coming. Inside, Yvonne began to take mental notes. The officer who processed her couldn't meet her eyes. The fingerprints, the mugshot, the cold bench. Each moment etched itself into her memory. Not as humiliation, but as testimony. She knew something deeper was at play. This wasn't a mistake. This was a message. A warning. A power move by those who had always resented her presence, her authority, her audacity to lead. But they had underestimated her. Because while the cuffs might have restrained her wrists, they couldn't touch her resolve. As the city buzzed with outrage, Yvonne made a silent vow. She would not be silenced. She would not retreat. She would confront every lie, every betrayal, every smear, not for herself alone, but for the next black woman who dared to wear the badge with honor. They had tried to break her spirit at dawn. What they didn't know was that dawn was always her beginning. By the time Yvonne Gaines was released on bail, the world outside had changed. It hadn't stopped turning, no. If anything, it had begun spinning faster, as though jolted awake by the injustice caught on camera. Eastbridge, once known for its quiet neighborhoods and sleepy civic pride, had become a flashpoint. Streets that once echoed with children's laughter now pulsed with chants. Protesters circled City Hall, Clergy held candlelight vigils on courthouse steps, and the local news couldn't run a single segment without flashing her mugshot. Stern, proud, and unbroken, she stepped into her home with her keys, still in a property bag. It felt foreign now. The same walls that had once been her refuge now pressed against her, thick with suspicion and betrayal. The smell of brewing coffee still lingered, stale now. Untouched from the morning, she was dragged away like a stranger. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. But she sat, silent, still, not out of defeat, but because she knew the storm was still gathering. Within days, her suspension was announced, indefinite, pending investigation. The department released a vague statement about serious concerns regarding her conduct, and the mayor, a longtime ally, offered carefully neutral remarks. "We trust the process," he said. But Yvonne knew better. In law enforcement, silence was rarely neutral. It was strategic. And her silence? They were betting on it. But what rattled her wasn't the arrest or even the suspension. It was the whispers that followed. Old friends who stopped returning her calls. Junior officers who had once looked to her for guidance, now avoiding her name like it was contagious. And then there was Captain Avery Sloan. He had been her deputy, her right hand, the man she had promoted, defended, and trusted in rooms where her presence had been tolerated only because of what she could deliver results. But now, Avery was the interim chief, appointed within 48 hours of her arrest. The move was swift, too swift, as if it had been prepared long before the cuffs clicked shut. Rumors swirled that it was Avery who had pushed the complaint, that he had met with the union behind closed doors, whispering about Yvonne's reforms being too radical, her methods destabilizing. It was under her leadership that the department had started bodycam audits, launched diversity recruitment drives, and reopened cold cases involving police misconduct. She thought he stood with her, but the air now reeked of betrayal. Late at night, alone in her den, surrounded by plaques and commendations, Yvonne sifted through old case files, starting with the shooting that had sparked everything. Jamal Trent, 17, unarmed, shot twice in the back. The officer involved had claimed a furtive movement. But bodycam footage, conveniently missing 2 minutes, told a different story. Jamal had run. That was all. He had run like so many black boys taught to fear the siren more than the streets. And for that, he had died. Yvonne had ordered the footage reviewed by an independent forensics lab. She had requested disciplinary proceedings, despite union pushback. And now, as pieces began falling into place, she realized her arrest wasn't just retaliation. It was a cover-up. She had come too close. She had dug too deep. Meanwhile, in the city, tensions climbed. Students walked out of classrooms. Churches filled with mothers holding photographs of sons who never came home. Community leaders, once skeptical of any police figure, now spoke her name like a symbol of something larger. She stood when the rest sat. One sat on live television, and they tried to bury her for it. Yvonne knew she had two choices: retreat into silence or step into the fire. But fire had always made her sharper. She contacted an old journalist she once helped protect during a protest raid, then a civil rights attorney with a reputation for uncovering institutional rot. Quietly, she began collecting her defense, not just legal but moral. She wasn't planning a comeback. No, she was building a reckoning. Because this wasn't just about her badge. It was about the rot behind it. The rot that smiled in meetings, shook her hand, and then slipped knives between her ribs when the lights went out. And now, as headlines blared and battle lines were drawn, one truth became impossible to ignore. Chief Yvonne Gaines was no longer just a police officer. She was becoming a symbol, and symbols, when betrayed, often spark revolutions. Chief Yvonne Gaines had spent her entire career towing a fragile line, one where honor and duty brushed against silence and complicity. But now, that line wasn't just fragile. It was broken, shattered by betrayal, lies, and the unrelenting churn of a system desperate to protect its own shadows. And in the middle of it stood Yvonne, not with a badge, but with something far more dangerous: truth. Each morning since her suspension, she sat by her window, watching squad cars patrol her street. They never stopped, never said a word, but they lingered, slowly, intentionally, like wolves circling a wounded lioness. Their message was clear. We're watching. But they didn't know Yvonne. She had been watched her whole life, by neighbors who questioned how a black girl could live in that part of town, by teachers who thought her brilliance was defiance, and by cops who never looked her in the eye until she outranked them. Watching her was never going to break her. It would only sharpen her focus. The call started trickling in, quietly, cautiously. First, a sergeant who once served under her. Then a patrol officer, newly minted and shaken. They spoke in whispers, never names. But the message was the same. Things were worse than she imagined. Reports being altered. Cameras turned off. Evidence lost. And most chilling of all, a pattern. A coordinated effort to silence complaints, especially those tied to minority victims. It wasn't just the Jamal Trent case. There were others, buried deep. Yvonne had once believed in reform from within. She thought a system built on oppression could be restructured by integrity, policy, and will. But now, she saw the cancer had roots. Deep ones. It wasn't just about bad apples. It was about the soil they were planted in. A system that rewarded silence, punished whistleblowers, and applauded order no matter the cost. The city, meanwhile, was splitting at its seams. Eastbridge hadn't seen this kind of unrest in decades. College students marched downtown, linking arms with pastors, grandmothers, and barbers. Local businesses posted signs reading, "We stand with Chief Gaines." Graffiti in alleyways showed her face with the words, "She protected us. Now we protect her." Yvonne watched it all unfold with a mix of sorrow and pride. They shouldn't have to fight for her. But they were. Because they saw what the system wanted to erase. Her humanity. Her lawyer, Malik Jeffries, was a force of nature. Young, sharp, unapologetically black. He had made a name suing city governments and winning. But even he was stunned by the volume of evidence Yvonne had quietly gathered over the years. "You've been building this for a long time," he said, scrolling through digital files, bodycam footage, and internal memos. She nodded. "I never trusted the system to police itself." But with every truth they uncovered, the stakes rose. Anonymous threats began arriving. Slashed tires. Dead silence on her landline. A single bullet left on her porch one morning. Her daughter, Jasmine, begged her to leave the city. "Just walk away, Mom," she pleaded, eyes rimmed with fear. "You've done enough." But what Jasmine didn't understand was that walking away would be the final betrayal. Not of her badge, not even of her name, but of every mother who buried a son with questions and no answers. Every community that feared sirens more than gunshots. Every young black girl who needed to see that dignity didn't have to come at the cost of justice. So Yvonne stayed, and she dug deeper. She and Malik uncovered proof of altered bodycam logs, a private group chat where officers joked about cleaning up cases, and emails showing internal affairs had quietly closed misconduct files with no review. The corruption wasn't hidden. It was just buried under paperwork and the silence of men in power. Then came the twist she hadn't expected. A USB drive mailed to her anonymously. No return address. Just one line scrawled in ink. They lied about Jamal. "Start with Avery." She opened the files. What she saw made her hands tremble, not with fear, but with fury. Footage from a training session Avery Sloan had led 6 months before Jamal's death. In it, he spoke casually of making stops stick, manipulating camera angles, and writing reports that matched the outcome you want. It wasn't just misconduct. It was doctrine. He had taught corruption, and he had taught it well. For the first time, Yvonne realized the fight ahead wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about pulling the entire rotten curtain down. And she would do it, even if it cost her everything. Because sometimes, justice doesn't wear a badge. It wears a scar. The morning Eastbridge woke up to the leaked footage was unlike any in recent memory. The video from the anonymous USB drive, gritty, time-stamped, undeniable, had been uploaded anonymously to a public whistleblower site. Within hours, it spread like wildfire. The voice of Lieutenant Avery Sloan, once hailed as a top instructor in the department, filled timelines and television screens across the nation. You don't wait for body cams to catch up. You lead the narrative. Write what aligns with the takedown. If they resist, say they reached. If they're confused, say they refused commands. The city gasped. But Yvonne Gaines? She just sat at her kitchen table, staring into her coffee, unmoved. Because she already knew. This wasn't a revelation, it was a confirmation. What rattled her wasn't the content. It was that someone from inside had leaked it. That meant there were cracks in the blue wall. Tiny fractures. And from those fractures, light was beginning to pour in. The mayor, under fire from every direction, finally broke her silence. In a stiff televised address, she called for an independent investigation into the Eastbridge Police Department and expressed deep concern over the footage. But Yvonne knew the dance. She had seen it before. Politicians didn't move because of morality. They moved because of optics. Because pressure mounted. And now the pressure wasn't coming from behind closed doors. It was erupting in the streets. Protesters lined the city hall steps. Some held candles. Others held signs. All of them chanted one name. Yvonne. The name the department tried to smear. The name her officers tried to bury under procedural jargon and PR statements. That name had now become a rallying cry. Inside her home, Jasmine watched nervously as her mother reviewed folders and files. "You're not going to stop, are you?" she asked, her voice soft, barely audible. Yvonne looked up. There was no anger in her eyes, only resolve. "No, I can't stop. Not when the truth is finally bleeding out." For the first time, Jasmine didn't argue. She just sat beside her, silently sorting through evidence. The scars of the arrest, the betrayal, the isolation, they hadn't broken Yvonne. They had forged her into something more dangerous than a badge, a witness with nothing left to lose. But Eastbridge wasn't ready for what came next. Yvonne and Malik Jeffries took their case to the public, not through lawsuits or backroom deals, but with a press conference on the courthouse steps. Reporters gathered in a thick knot. Microphones and cameras pointed at her as she stood tall in a plain black suit, stripped of the uniform they once celebrated. There were no medals on her chest, but her voice carried more authority than any badge could offer. "I was wrongfully arrested in the city I served," she began. "But this is not just my story. This is the story of a system that teaches officers how to lie more convincingly than it teaches them to de-escalate. This is about a culture of fear, control, and silence." Her words hit like thunder. Not dramatic, not poetic, just real. Too real to ignore. She called out the chain of command, named names, referenced policies and procedures, quoted statistics that showed how black residents were 5 times more likely to be stopped, 3 times more likely to be searched, and 7 times more likely to be charged with resisting arrest, even when bodycam footage showed no resistance. It was a public unmasking, and it sent shockwaves. Inside the department, the fractures deepened. A few brave officers started stepping forward. Testimonies came in. Confidential reports. Whispered phone calls. Some were anonymous. Some weren't. But they all told the same story. Eastbridge PD had operated with 2 sets of rules, one for its officers and one for the public. And when officers like Yvonne Gaines tried to blur that line, they were punished. Then, just when things seemed to gain momentum, the backlash struck. A doctored video surfaced online. It showed Yvonne yelling during a protest from years back, edited to make her look aggressive, irrational. It was quickly debunked, but not before the damage was done. Conservative news anchors pounced. "Is this the kind of woman we want leading our cities?" One sneered. Another segment called her a disgrace in uniform. Yvonne watched in silence. She didn't flinch, because she knew the playbook. When they can't discredit the facts, they try to discredit the person. But what they forgot was that this time, the city was watching. And this time, the people weren't buying it. The truth, no matter how long buried, had found a voice. And her name was Chief Yvonne Gaines. The city of Eastbridge was a boiling pot now. Protesters marched daily, holding handmade signs that read "Justice for Yvonne," "No more blue silence," and "Reform the force." Each night, drone footage of the city glowed with candlelight vigils and flashing squad cars. And in the center of it all stood a woman who never wanted to be a martyr, Chief Yvonne Gaines. But truth comes with a cost. And now, that cost was knocking on her door in quiet, brutal ways. Her bank account was under investigation. Her daughter's scholarship was suspended pending review. And a former captain she'd once demoted was making rounds on conservative talk shows, claiming Yvonne had a vendetta against good officers. The same men who once saluted her in full uniform now called her rogue, unfit, emotional. The silence of the department had become its weapon, but so had its whispers. Late one night, she returned to find her front door slightly ajar. Jasmine had been home. Panic surged through her like a wave. She bolted up the steps, heart thundering. "Jazz," she called out. Her daughter emerged from the hallway, shaken but unharmed. Someone had broken in, not to steal, but to leave a message. A single, unmarked manila envelope had been placed on the kitchen table. Inside, a black and white photo of her car's license plate circled in red ink, and a sticky note that read, "Walk away, Yvonne, while you still can." She didn't sleep that night. She just sat in the living room, watching over Jasmine, who curled on the couch with red-rimmed eyes and a blanket wrapped tight around her. This was no longer just about justice. It was a warning war. And Yvonne understood the stakes, now more than ever. They weren't just trying to silence her. They were trying to break her. But the truth has a spine, and hers refused to bend. The next day, she went back on air. Not on a national stage this time, but on a small Eastbridge community podcast hosted by a retired black teacher named Harriet Monroe. The production was modest, a dim room, a single camera, and a mic with peeling foam. But the voice that carried through the episode echoed across the city like a hymn of resistance. "They can take my pension, my reputation, my peace of mind," Yvonne said, calm but resolute. "But what they won't take is my voice. I'm still here. I'm still watching. And I know I'm not alone anymore." The episode went viral, not because of theatrics, but because of its raw honesty. Yvonne didn't cry. She didn't yell. She spoke the way women like her had always had to, measured, restrained, unshakable. And it worked. The people listened, some for the first time. Meanwhile, Malik Jeffries was building a case. His legal team had gathered sworn statements from current and former officers, video footage, internal memos, and bodycam logs mysteriously deleted within 48 hours of Yvonne's arrest. It painted a damning picture of systemic suppression, targeting, and a deliberate attempt to discredit her reform initiatives. But just as the momentum seemed unstoppable, another blow came. Internal Affairs launched an official inquiry into Yvonne's tenure. Not into her arrest, not into the systemic abuses, but into her. Accusations of improper handling of departmental funds, biased promotions, and failure to report misconduct suddenly surfaced. It was retaliation, thinly veiled and vicious. Jasmine broke down when the notice came in the mail. "Mom, they're trying to erase you." Yvonne held her. "Let them try," she whispered. "But I know the truth, and truth outlives scandal." Still, she was tired. Not weak, but tired. The kind of weariness that seeped into your bones when every breath felt like resistance. Every step, defiance. On Sunday, she went to her old church. The congregation had dwindled in recent years, but this time the pews were full. She didn't wear her uniform. She wore white, not for purity, but for peace. As she sat through the sermon, heads turned toward her with solemn reverence, some with tears, others with nods of quiet solidarity. Outside, the mural across from the church had changed. A new artist had painted over the old bricks with a portrait of Yvonne, no badge, no cap, just her eyes, sharp and unwavering, staring into the soul of the city. And beneath the portrait, one word written in bold strokes, "Unbroken." It was a reminder. The system could smear her name. They could knock on her door in the dark. But what they couldn't do, what they would never do, was silence her truth. And the city? It was finally learning how to listen. Chief Yvonne Gaines had faced down gang leaders, murder suspects, and angry crowds in riot gear. But nothing compared to walking back into Eastbridge's police headquarters, not as the commanding officer, but as the woman they tried to erase. Her uniform was replaced with a navy blue blazer, No badge, no gun, just truth, walking through hostile silence. The notice from Internal Affairs had summoned her for questioning, formally, under oath. Accusations swirling around her name, like vultures in the sky. Her alleged misuse of funds was a recycled lie, born from a single clerical error, something her assistant had already corrected months ago. But now it was a weapon, a cover, a distraction. When she stepped into the lobby, officers looked up from desks, from coffee, from whispered conversations. Some averted their eyes. Others just stared. Only one, Officer D. Alston, gave her a subtle nod. A small flicker of decency in a building that had forgotten what that meant. The interrogation room wasn't unfamiliar to her. She'd sat across this table many times, but never on this side. Across from her sat Captain Ross Farnell, the man she'd once suspended for falsifying a report that led to a teenager's wrongful detention. He was clean-shaven now, wearing a smug smile like it was regulation issued. "Let's begin," he said, clicking his pen like a gavel. For over 2 hours, they picked at her legacy. Budget line items, travel logs, body cam footage reviews, all twisted into a narrative of negligence. But Yvonne didn't flinch. She knew what they were doing, trying to bury the truth beneath paperwork and bad faith questions. Still, she answered, calm, precise. Not for them, but for the record. Every word was a document. Every sentence a seed for the case Malik Jeffries was building outside those walls. When she left the station that afternoon, it wasn't over. It was only beginning. Later that evening, she met Malik at a small, discreet office above a community center. He looked exhausted, beard stubbled, tie askew, eyes red. But his hands trembled with the energy of a man chasing justice, like it owed him money. "They're scared," he said, sliding a folder toward her. "We found something. Something big." Inside the folder were screenshots, texts between Captain Farnell and another officer, discussions of shutting her down, of leaking half-truths to the press, of prepping the public for her fall. Yvonne stared at the paper, her throat tightening. "There's more," Malik said. "Remember the precinct audit you ordered in January? Turns out the resistance you faced wasn't about timing. It was about exposure. That audit would have uncovered a pattern of falsified overtime reports, misallocated equipment, and suppressed complaints. All under Farnell's watch. Her instincts had been right, all along. But knowing it and proving it were two different battles. She sat in silence for a moment, fingers clenched. "They want me gone because I kept receipts," she said quietly. "No," Malik replied. "They want you gone because you weren't afraid to use them." The next day, a whistleblower, an anonymous sergeant, sent a flash drive to a local investigative journalist. Inside, 10 years worth of emails, reports, and internal memos detailing misconduct buried under layers of bureaucracy. The journalist reached out to Yvonne before airing it. "Do you want to go on record?" she asked. Yvonne didn't hesitate. "Yes, but I'm not here to burn the department down. I'm here to cleanse it." The article dropped like a thunderclap. Headlines exploded. "Cover up in Eastbridge PD. Hero chief framed by her own." The narrative shifted. Fast. Support surged. Past victims of police misconduct in Eastbridge came forward, emboldened by her courage. A group of young black cadets from the local academy wrote her a letter, calling her a lighthouse in a sea of sirens. It moved her more than any award ever had. But not everyone was happy. Farnell went on defense. The mayor distanced himself. An emergency city council session was called to review Eastbridge PD leadership. As Yvonne stood before her mirror that night, staring into eyes that had seen too much, she knew a storm was coming. But storms didn't scare her. What scared her was silence. And silence was no longer an option. She put her blazer back on. Her armor wasn't metal anymore. It was truth. And it fit better than any badge ever did. The morning of the emergency city council session arrived like a drumbeat. The sky over Eastbridge was overcast, swollen with the weight of a city caught between truth and shame. Inside the council chamber, the air crackled. Press cameras lined the back wall. City officials whispered behind clipped ties, and protesters outside chanted Yvonne Gaines' name like a battle cry. What began as a smear campaign had transformed into something else, a movement. Chief Yvonne Gaines wasn't scheduled to speak. The mayor made that clear the night before in a curt statement. Chief Gaines is not under review, but remains under investigation. But Yvonne hadn't come to follow anyone else's script. She came with purpose, with truth, with fire in her veins and generations of silence in her shadow. As the council opened with formalities, the mayor, a polished man named Donovan Epps, tried to control the tempo. He was a master of public optics, calm voice, measured phrases, avoiding any word that might hint at liability. He referenced the department's challenges and the need for greater transparency, but never once acknowledged the word at the center of it all: corruption. Outside the chamber, the chants grew louder. When Malik Jeffries entered the room, flanked by 3 citizens holding signed affidavits, the atmosphere shifted. He carried with him more than documents. He carried stories, names, and truths once buried under police silence. And in his hand was a sealed letter, stamped by the county grand jury, confirming an investigation into misconduct within the Eastbridge Police Department. Councilwoman Darnell, one of the few who had quietly supported Yvonne, raised her voice. "Madam Chief," she said, "would you like to address these proceedings?" There was a pause, a beat of stunned hesitation, and then Yvonne stood. She walked slowly to the podium, her heels echoing off the marble floor. Her presence was no longer one of command, but of conviction. She was a woman who had been stripped, humiliated, and left to rot, but had refused to wither. Her hands didn't shake. Her gaze didn't falter. She began not with accusations, but with a story. A boy named Jamari, 15 years old, pulled over by officers for looking suspicious while riding his bike. A boy who ended up in juvenile detention for a curfew violation because no one in the department cared enough to ask questions except her. She talked about the audit she initiated, the resistance she faced, the nights she slept in her office, trying to untangle a system built to hide its sins. Then she paused. She told them about the arrest, how she'd been handcuffed on her own street by officers who knew exactly who she was, who claimed it was routine. She reminded them of the footage, of the voice commands ignored, of the shove that never made the official report. She didn't ask for pity. She demanded accountability. "The rot," she said, "was never just a few bad apples. It was the orchard, and when you asked me to clean it, I tried. But some of you wanted to torch the orchard to protect the worms." Gasps rippled through the room. The cameras zoomed in. She continued, naming names, not of guilt, but of complicity. The silent ones, the indifferent, the conveniently blind. She cited exact dates, internal memos, and blocked investigations. It wasn't just passionate, it was surgical. By the time she finished, the room was silent. Even the mayor, who had rehearsed his non-answers, looked rattled. Outside, the chants turned into cheers. Word had already spread. In that moment, Yvonne didn't feel victorious. She felt exposed, raw, but she also felt something she hadn't in weeks seen. Not just as the first black female police chief of Eastbridge, but as a woman who chose the hard road, who stood when she was told to kneel, who roared when they tried to silence her. Back in her car, she sat still for a long time. The city's skyline stared back at her, tall, indifferent, unchanged. But deep down, she knew something had cracked. A dam, a wall, a lie that had lasted too long. Malik called. "They want you back on air." MSNBC. Prime time. She smiled faintly, not out of vanity, but because she understood now. This was never just about her. It was about every woman who'd been passed over, every officer who had spoken up and been crushed for it, every young black kid who looked at a badge and saw a threat. The fire they tried to burn her with was now lighting the path forward. The city of Eastbridge was wide awake now. Headlines didn't just ask questions anymore. They pointed fingers. The tide had turned. But for Chief Yvonne Gaines, vindication wasn't a warm embrace. It was cold, surgical, and slow. Every step toward justice still felt like walking through molasses, like pulling truth from the mouth of a machine designed to swallow it whole. In the days following her city council speech, walls that once seemed impenetrable began to crack. Whistleblowers, emboldened by her testimony, stepped forward one by one. Officers from within the department, previously gagged by fear or loyalty, submitted confidential statements. A lieutenant leaked internal disciplinary records that had been altered to protect favored officers. A training supervisor shared how body cam footage was inadvertently lost during high-profile stops, especially those involving Black or Latino residents. For the first time in her career, Yvonne was both the target and the torchbearer. She was fighting to prove her own innocence, while simultaneously unraveling a web of systemic rot that spanned over a decade. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent years protecting this institution, believing reform was possible from within. Now, it was the very institution trying to eat her alive. But outside the precinct walls, something remarkable was happening. A group of local college students launched a campaign. #JusticeForGaines. It wasn't flashy. No hashtags drowned in emojis. It was raw. It was real. They canvassed neighborhoods with pamphlets detailing her case, held town halls and community centers, and pressured local businesses to demand transparency from the city government. Yvonne's name, once reduced to a scandal, was being reclaimed as a symbol. Yet, even with the growing momentum, the pressure was unrelenting. Mayor Donovan Epps remained evasive. He danced around reporters, offered empty platitudes, and formed a blue-ribbon commission on police ethics, a bureaucratic stall tactic. But what Epps didn't anticipate was the second leak. It was a 14-minute audio file, a conversation between the mayor and Captain Ross Farnell, recorded months before Yvonne's arrest. In it, Epps was heard saying, "She's a liability now. We can't control her. If she goes public with what she knows, it'll take half the department down." The clip aired on national television. That night, Yvonne watched the segment alone, in her small apartment away from the home she once shared with prestige and honor. The voice that had once offered her a promotion if she played by the rules was now heard, conspiring to end her. Her hands trembled, not with fear, but with a surge of righteous fury. She wasn't just defending her name anymore. She was dragging the skeletons of an entire system into the light. The next morning, protests erupted in front of City Hall. Not angry mobs, but organized resistance. Clergy members locked arms with teachers. Youth activists stood alongside retired veterans. They carried signs that read, "We believe her. We want better. We want Gaines." And yet, the system still fought back. That afternoon, she received an official letter from the Office of the Inspector General. Her badge was still suspended. The investigation was ongoing. The words were mechanical, stripped of empathy. But Yvonne read between the lines. It wasn't about justice. It was about delay. About wearing her down. About hoping she'd walk away. But she wouldn't. Later that evening, she appeared on live television. No pre-interview. No soft questions. Just Yvonne, sitting across from a primetime anchor, facing millions. She spoke without notes. She explained what reform looks like when it's real. How body cams mean nothing if they're disabled at will. How community policing rings hollow when community complaints vanish into thin air. She broke down how racism in policing wasn't always about slurs or bullets, but about patterns, protection, and silence. And when the anchor asked if she still wanted to return as chief, she paused. "No," she said. "I want to build something new. Because this old house, it's on fire, and patching the roof won't save it." That quote trended overnight. People began calling her the rebuilder. But Yvonne wasn't interested in titles anymore. She had learned the hard way that a badge can't protect you from betrayal, and that sometimes the truth needs to be louder than your rank. The system had tried to erase her. Instead, she had become the voice it could no longer ignore. The courtroom was quiet, not the kind of silence that comes from respect, but the silence that holds its breath, waiting to see whether the system would betray its own promises once again. Chief Yvonne Gaines sat at the witness table, not in uniform, not in cuffs, but in something far heavier, the burden of truth. It had been 6 long months since her life had been turned upside down. 6 months of whispers in hallways, of headlines swinging from outrage to doubt and back again. But today, as she prepared to testify in the federal civil rights inquiry into her arrest, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Stillness inside herself. Not peace. Not yet. But clarity. She knew why she was here. She spoke with the same composure that had once earned her the trust of an entire city. Her voice didn't tremble. Her gaze didn't falter. She recounted the night of her arrest, not with bitterness, but with precision. How the officers who once saluted her dragged her out of her car like a stranger. How no questions were asked, only commands barked. How the cuffs were tight. How they wouldn't meet her eyes. But more than the facts, she spoke about the fear behind the badge. The institutional paranoia that sees reform as betrayal. The legacy of policing that protects its own shadows more than the people it claims to serve. She named names, exposed memos, dissected policies, not to destroy, but to demand better. And when the prosecutor asked what she hoped would come from all this, Yvonne didn't talk about lawsuits or settlements or reinstatement. "I want accountability," she said. "But more than that, I want my story to mean something for the next black girl who wants to lead and isn't afraid to speak truth. I want her to know it's not weakness to demand change. It's power." Outside the courtroom, reporters jostled to capture her exit. Supporters lined the courthouse steps, holding signs with her face, her name, her message. But Yvonne didn't linger. She didn't need the cameras. The real audience, the one that mattered, was watching from kitchen tables, phone screens, school auditoriums, from everywhere that silence had been a substitute for safety. In the weeks that followed, Eastbridge began to shift. The mayor resigned. Internal affairs was gutted and rebuilt under civilian oversight. The department launched a transparency portal, allowing citizens to track complaints and use of force reports in real time. And the city council passed the Gaines Accountability Bill, mandating independent reviews of all arrests involving senior law enforcement officials and requiring implicit bias training across all departments. But for Yvonne, the fight wasn't over. It had only evolved. She turned down the offer to return as chief. She said the badge would always mean something to her. But now, her mission was bigger. She started a foundation, the Unbroken Project, a platform amplifying the stories of whistleblowers, reformers, and survivors of systemic injustice. Through podcasts, public forums, and school visits, she began to plant the seeds of a new kind of justice, one rooted in listening, in reckoning, in hope. And on the anniversary of her arrest, she returned to the same intersection where it all went down, the place where flashing lights had turned her into a suspect, where power turned its back on its own integrity. The city had painted a mural there now, a towering image of her silhouette in uniform, one hand raised not in defense, but in defiance. She stood beneath it, surrounded by young people, some holding signs, some just watching. One girl, maybe 13, stepped forward. Her braids were tight, her eyes wide. "Are you still scared?" she asked. Yvonne smiled. "Not the kind you fake for a crowd, the kind that comes after the storm, when the air is clean and your scars remind you that you survived." "Sometimes," she admitted, "but I'm louder than my fear now." That moment, that one sentence, was the heartbeat of the movement she had sparked. Because this wasn't just about her. It was about a system that had been too comfortable in silence. It was about a city learning how to confront its own reflection. It was about us, all of us, choosing whether to look away or lean in. So if you're reading this, and something stirred in you, don't let it fade. Speak up. Show up. Call things by their name. Because stories like Yvonne's don't belong in silence. They belong in the light. If this story moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Every voice raised brings us closer to justice. Until next time, stay brave, stay aware, and stay unbroken.